It's a really interesting one, and I'm quite biased because I didn't have traditional design education. So you may think of this as going to go one way. So I study computer science, and you actually see many people studying computer science and engineering and then transitioning into product design. And similarly, you find people that study things like marketing or people that get into things like customer support and then realize that, oh, something interesting in product design and UX. And I actually think you really don't need traditional design education. It's not a bad thing. You might find people that do get that design education, whether that's branding design and packaging and traditional arts, or you might get people that study interaction design, for example. And that's a wonderful thing because they come with all of this academic knowledge. But I think one of the wonderful things with product design is that it's really open and flexible based on everyone's different trajectory and unique set of experiences. And what the way that I like to think about it is your trajectory and your past experience often gives you this superpower in product design. So you often see people coming from marketing and copywriting and the agency world, and they become incredible product designers because they just have this natural talent and knack for copy, UX copy, narrative, storytelling, which is so predominant in product design and makes for really delightful experiences. Similarly, you might get people with an engineering background that might have this very systematic thinking, really great problem solving skills. And of course, they're incredible working with engineers. And then you may have all of those people with traditional design background that have all of this traditional design knowledge, the typography, the color, layout, which again, you see it applied in product design. It makes for really nice, really aesthetic experiences. So for me, it's really wonderful because it's open to any trajectory.
Yeah, I think that resonates strongly, Filippos. Like there is, I mean, there's been this real shift. If I look over, say, the last 10 years, right, with the growth of big tech companies like Google and Facebook and all of those, you know, you could see this initial cultural seed being planted from engineering, really, right? It's this idea of the self-taught engineer and the idea that, you know, because of the availability of all of the resources online. I remember the growth of the MOOC and the idea that, you know, you don't have to have an academic background to be a great computer engineer. And that, I think, translated over into design, into product, into different disciplines in this space, right? The idea of, well, you know, you would apply for a role at any company coming from a different background and be an exceptional designer or engineer, right? That, I think, is a real shift I've seen in the industry. And then the other piece that's interesting is there's a real cultural foundation for this, because a little over 10 years ago, there wasn't any traditional degree path into UX or product design, right? Like there was, so I myself studied industrial design, which was like a degree you could get then. That really was my path into design and product design. And I think there were a lot of folks, and there still are a lot of folks in the industry who've come in from computer engineering, from HCI, and then also like in the user research space, like coming in through psychology or sociology or anthropology. So there are sort of these non-traditional paths via traditional university directions, right? Like anthropology into user research. But there's also then, I see this more and more, and I think it really comes from that shift. People coming in from architecture, or I spoke to someone who's coming in from finance the other day. And that doesn't mean that, you know, you can stand one day and be working as a, you know, mergers and acquisitions specialist, and then tomorrow you're a UX designer with nothing beyond the will. Like there's a lot of growth and mastery and real expertise required. But I think the truth is that there are many paths into this, from boot camps and I should say apprenticeships, right? Obviously coming from Multiverse, but also self-taught designers are some of the strongest ones that I know. So I think there's a real, really new opportunity here, and it is met with a culture that is welcoming. It does have this history of helping each other out, and really welcomes it. I actually have spoken to a couple people over the past few weeks who are doing exactly this. So I have some very specific thoughts. So one is that I think boot camps, like a good boot camp is really valuable, but there's a gap in terms of what most boot camps will give you. So I think there's a lot of great, there's a lot of value in doing client work, like doing mock-ups, creating high fidelity prototypes. But the gap is going to be around implementation, working cross-functionally with product and engineering. That's a really important gap. And I think, there are very few junior roles, and a lot of folks who are moving in from another discipline, maybe a junior role isn't actually right for them. Like they might have a lot of depth and breadth already that can be applied, but it's hard for them to get to that role without that cross-functional collaboration and that experience with building. So I think maybe my one recommendation would be, like, find a client project on your own where you can build something and get comfortable with that. And that'll get you in the door more quickly than applying directly for those very few true junior roles and those mid-level roles without that experience.
And I would completely agree with that. And I've had so many conversations about boot camps and whether I should go to university or if I should join XYZ boot camp and if it should be a live boot camp or online. And I really think it depends on the person. It's such a personal choice. I'm sure, Rachel, you've seen this again, and Jen, you as well. By speaking to many people, I think you can clearly tell there's some people that would really benefit from a bootcamp experience, something that is very tailored, something that is very structured, and there's a formal process. And then again, you might see other people that are venturing into the product design space. They're very much like self-taught geniuses and don't need that formal process and structure. And I think the most important thing is determine what is the level of education and the type of education that you need to get the basic knowledge. But then it's all about getting to action as quickly as possible. And I think very much what you said, if you have the opportunity to find that junior, or maybe if you're lucky, a mid-level role with someone that wants to invest in you and you get that chance of joining a company, then by all means do that. If not, and you're struggling with that, then doing client work and doing some freelancing to get started and getting in the market in some commercial project with real restrictions, real stakeholders with real opinions, I think that's the best way to really start your career growth. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think the reality is also that it's not only boot camps that have that gap, right? Like universities have that gap. Pretty much every traditional or non-traditional education path into UX has that gap. And again, I will shamelessly flog the like applied learning piece, right? Like, again, from the Multiverse background and thinking about apprenticeships, like for us, applied learning is really the key. And I think this is so true for design, where like I had an educational background that was very project focused, and we had to build things, we had to design things, they had to, like, in some cases go to clients, and like they sometimes were implemented, and that was really, really valuable. So I think that's the thing I would be trying to mimic if I were trying to enter the field now.
So I would say the advice that I give most people that are at junior level, come straight out of education, is yes, personal projects are a great way to build your portfolio, build some case studies. Are they great? Are they going to get you 100% there? Definitely no, because again, you don't have that real life restriction, the real life collaboration with other people, but they're a good first step to show that you understand some of the basics, you understand the UX fundamentals, you have some visual design chops, and you figure out what is the end-to-end process of coming up with the concept and implementing it. And I would say one of the best ways to do that is take a product that you're using, or someone using, focus on a real problem that you can resonate with, and really try to couple it, understand it, and create a different solution for it. And at least that's going to show your hiring manager or your client that you can work with some sort of realistic scenario and product and structure. So I think that's a really good way to go, rather than doing a conceptual project about a hypothetical company with hypothetical problems that don't really exist. Aside from that, I think the goal is to get to a real problem as quickly as you can. So if that's finding someone that is from your personal network by asking people around you, doing some entry-level work, whether that's project-based or whether that's on a freelancing platform, I think those are really, really good ways to get that real-life experience. So that's probably where I would start to build that case study and that portfolio.
I like the grounding it in a real problem as a kind of focal point. And then the pieces that I've been thinking about were, so first of all, a personal project is valuable, but agree, it doesn't get you all the way there. If you ground it in a real problem, that's a little more valuable. Then I thought, oh, well, what if you had a friend who's an engineer? Could you guys work together to plan to build something to solve that problem? Could you take the field from which you're transitioning and take a problem from there that you know really well, better than any designer because they've not done it? Can you bring that problem over? Could you look at the competitors? Like as you start to build that out, I would pull in as many real elements as possible, whether that's a client or whether that's like an engineering friend who's also moving into their new space and wants to collaborate. Like I would look for ways to kind of build that as realistically as you could. And I think that could get you part of the way there. And in particular, get you to that like understanding the real barriers and the like, not just design problems, but the client problems, the collaboration problems, the implementation challenges, all of those pieces that make up kind of the meat of it. Yeah, I think they're really like strong opportunities in both spaces. So I think on the FAANG side, you have just a lot of real depth and expertise and knowledge. So like a thing that you get as a designer kind of coming up in FAANG is, you know, that your company probably has some of the world's best designers, some of the world's best user researchers, and you're going to get a chance to work with them and get mentored by them, and like they will take your call, right? Like you'll be able to message the, you know, leading product manager leader in the world and say like, hey, I'd love to get coffee, you know, do you have a few minutes, right? So I think there's something there that is just, it's institutional in knowledge, and that has a lot of value. The gap though is in FAANG, like you'll just have less scope. So you won't have to figure out as much yourself. And I think that's the thing where like if your personality benefits from a lot of structure, a lot of expertise, a lot of depth, like I found a lot of value in working in FAANG relatively early in my career after having freelance, worked at a couple of little agencies, like this kind of thing. On the flip side, I think the startup world is really interesting because you just have so much scope and responsibility, right? Like if you're the kind of person who really, really benefits from, you know, having a problem thrusted upon you and someone saying, well, better go figure it out. Like that's what the startup world will give you. Now, the gap will be that expertise, right? There will be less structure, a little more chaos. And if you thrive on that, I think that's a really good space. And I'll say that it's also a spectrum. So it's funny because when I describe a startup now, I'm describing my role on the Chrome team in 2013. Oh my God, I'm so old. But that's not really quite how it is today. And depends a little bit which team you're on. It depends a little bit which startup you're at. Maybe it's a larger startup and it does have structure. So there's also a lot of nuance to it. And I think people have to kind of dig in and understand like, well, what series is the startup and like what size is their design team? And maybe they have really, like we are a scale up and we have a lot of really strong design leaders on our team who provide amazing mentorship for our like amazing mid-level designers. And so they get that experience, but have also that kind of scope for impact. So it depends.
I couldn't agree more. I think to Rachel's points, and I think it's so interesting when you're starting your career, you feel like all of these are really important decisions, but in reality, they're not. I think people should grasp the best opportunity that is out there for them. So I think if you're starting off, try both. I think there's no harm in joining a FAANG company or joining a large corporation and seeing how you feel with having so many people around and tapping into that expertise or tapping into an existing process and becoming part of that versus a startup where, you know, to Rachel's point, you basically own the process. And many of that is basically, oh, go figure out how we do this. I think there's nothing more impactful than trying many things early on in your career, from freelancing to joining a startup of different and varying sizes to joining a big corporation and a FAANG company. I think once you do that and you gain just a bit of that insight as to how it feels, I think that's when you can really make a decision. And I think that's when you need to start becoming a bit more strategic as to what you choose. And I would almost advise anyone to basically make a matrix of all the things that matter to them. Is it more about having impact? And how do you measure that impact? Is it impact about, you know, doing something and creating products that millions use, or is it impact in terms of your personal decisions having a big impact on the company outcome. I think that's a very personal decision, and what it means to me might be very different to what it means to someone else. Then there's the status and how important it is to have a name in your CV. To someone, it might be extremely important. To other people, might not mean anything. There's the personal growth you're going to experience in a company. There's the people that are going to be around you, to that talent point that Rachel mentioned. There's pay, there's benefits. So I think you need to gauge all of those things, and find that balance and what it means to you. I think with a startup, is going to get more ownership, more autonomy, and then sometimes more growth, just because the sheer amount of things you need to uncover and decouple and solve for is just going to be more, and there's going to be less process, and you're going to get things that are less ready to solve for. But then on the other hand, there's many people that get overwhelmed by the startup environment, and we often see people coming from big corporations and enterprises. They feel like, oh, there's something really cool about joining a startup, and then at the end of the day, it just doesn't work for them, because they realize they're much better off in a process that's already set up, and there's people that know exactly what they're doing, and they get a bit more concrete information on what's the right problem to solve and what's the right solution. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's very different opinions, and I'm not sure if I'm the most popular opinion. I think there's a couple of things here. One is, how much should be in your portfolio. So like, should you go for depth? Should you go for breadth? And I think that's a really interesting one. Another one is, if I don't have any realistic projects, what do I put in my portfolio? And then there's this talk about how to structure a case study or a portfolio piece. And again, there's varying different opinions. So I think on the first bit, I'm a very big advocate of opting for less in most cases and for most designers, unless you're going for a leadership role where you really need to show breadth, not just in design execution, but also strategy and leadership. I think for mid-level roles, senior level roles, all I want to see most times is 1 to 2 really polished case studies. And I'm not talking about polish just in terms of the visual design and the aesthetics, but I want to see an end-to-end story of what was the problem, how did you go about uncovering it, decoupling it, understanding if that was the right problem, who did you work with, what was your ideation process, what was the results, how did you measure that, what was the impact. And I think that recipe, obviously, it might be different from one person to the other, but I think that end to end, showing you the beginning to the end of that process, just for 1 or 2 really nice and interesting problems, is in most cases what I want to see from people. Now, I think once you have that, there is that luxury of adding more to your case study. And then one of the first things that I would try to do is, once you've built that experience and you have different pieces that you could add in your portfolio, I would think really carefully of how to tailor my case studies and how to tailor my portfolio based on what company I'm applying for or which client I'm presenting to. And I think, again, that's a luxury that not every designer is going to have. But I think it's so important and so impactful when you're applying for, let's say, a health tech role, if we're talking about manual, to see portfolio piece and case studies that have to do with healthcare. Or if you're applying for a mobile app design role, you should be able to show, a mobile app piece, because the hiring manager and the designer and the product person, the stakeholder, will instantly see this, and they're going to relate, and they're going to resonate, and they're going to understand what you're presenting. So I would do as little as possible, as long as it has a lot of depth, and then start adding variety with the purpose of being able to tailor that presentation and those case studies to the people that you're applying for. And I think the third thing that I would say is, very much to the first point we spoke about, if you don't have a lot of portfolio pieces, just again, what company are you applying for? Find a similar company, or find a problem that this company is going to resonate with, and really uncover that and decouple it as an actual problem, and think of all the restrictions and make your own assumptions, and just show them how you would approach that same problem. And that's something that many hiring managers are going to seriously appreciate, and at least are going to find very interesting. Rachel, what do you think?
I think we're very well aligned, Filippos. I too have a strong preference for fewer projects with more depth. And I think, so I won't repeat what you said, but I do think what I can add is that editing is really critical. So I think a thing I see often is I know that folks who are kind of new to the field or entering the field really want to show everything they can do. And I think like historically there was a lot more expectation for portfolios to contain like many projects and show all of your styles, because it was much more linked to like graphic design or art, and the idea that you could only do one style, and so you need to show all the styles that you're capable of. And I think we've moved quite a lot past that. And maybe we've like tipped in the other direction. But a thing I see is that because of this impetus, there are designers out there who feel like they have to show everything, and they end up showing many projects, but not just their best projects. That kind of the portfolio is weighed down by the weakest link. And as a designer younger or earlier in your career, you grow so quickly. So I think that's part of what I see is if I see your first project in there and your most recent project, that often that first project is nowhere near as good as that most recent project. And to be honest, I'd rather just see that most recent one. So I think that's part of it too. It's not necessarily recency, but it's really just your best one or two things, not your last 6 to 9. I think that's pretty key. And then I'll say, like, I wrote a whole article about this with like lists of things that I care about seeing, and they lined up really closely with what you said, Filippos, so I won't repeat. But the piece that you mentioned about a complete story. So Jem, you've hired with me before, so you know that one of the things I care a lot about is seeing the logic and progression of that problem solving. So in step 1, we decided this was the problem, and we figured out that the way we're going to know if we've solved that problem is if we push this metric, right? We think that this is the way we're going to know. And then at the end, well, you tried to push that metric. Did it move? Did you solve it? And do you know? And I think that's kind of part of the story that I'm looking for as well, which is like, if you tried to do a thing, then do you know if you did do that thing? Like it's very like basic, but I think it's also really important for us. Like if I think of myself in my practice as a designer, it's the like, well, I'm not just making something beautiful. I'm trying to solve a problem.
I could talk about this for 3-4 hours, so I think I'll try to pick out some interesting nuggets. So, I mean, generative AI is genuinely wild. I think the transformation we've seen is just incredible, and I think it's only the beginning and the tipping point of what we're about to see in the next 5-10 years. Has it changed how we design or how we build products? I don't think it's changed just yet, but I think it's very likely it's going to change completely if you look at it in the long term and in the next 5 to 10 years. So I think so far we've seen some change, especially in some operational pieces. I think for us as a team at Manual, a lot of our research operations, a lot of the administrative work, note taking and synthesizing, this is all being really boosted and very much automated with the use of generative AI tools. It's not always 100% successful, but we're definitely seeing great improvement in manual work that we used to do in the past that is now fully automated with great results. I think the really interesting bit for me, and actually I think there's 2 really interesting pieces. One is, how will AI change the design process, but like really change the design process from understanding problems to coming up with solutions? I think the execution part of design is definitely ripe for disruption. So I see no reason why an AI model in a couple of years would be able to help us make the right design decisions, rather than us looking at benchmarking data and research studies and using different practices and seeing what our competitors are doing. I think AI models are definitely going to be able to help with that. And I think as part of that, I see design becoming much more of a strategic function, which is a great and a bad thing. So I think the execution part of design is definitely going to be secondary to what is, to what's really important, which is, what are the right problems? What do our users want? What is the right strategy for our product as a whole? So I see design becoming much more of a strategic function within the product department in a business. I think what this is going to create, and again, I'm just hypothesizing here, and this may be far from what's reality. I think this is going to create very big obstacles for people entering the field of design, because I think what's going to happen is, if you don't go through the countless hours of designing and failing and doing things in the wrong way, or learning how to do research, or learning how to take notes, and learning how to synthesize that data. If all of this is automated and you're just entering the design field, where do you focus? Do you focus on learning that just for the fundamental knowledge, or do you focus on learning how an AI model works, and then you're just operating an AI model? I think to me, this is really, really interesting, especially coming from, people like us that went through kind of like the Photoshop days, the Illustrator days, Sketch, and then Figma, to now generative AI, which is completely transforming industries. I think it's really interesting to see what the next generation of product designers are going to do in order to still have that gradual growth and maturity in their design roles, and how those entry design roles are going to change. I would love to hear Rachel's opinion on that.
Thanks, Filippos. Yeah, I think there's so much richness here. So I'll also try to synthesize my thoughts. I think I'll build on where you just landed. So I think there's an interesting piece, not just about entering the field and what that will mean. I can imagine it will quite radically change the path to entry. But I also think it might change the definitions of the roles themselves. I think the whole thing feels very frightening for people. Like, we won't have any jobs in the future. But I think you and I both been through this progression of tooling, and the idea that, like, well, if Figma is built for actually designing for UI, well, all the valuable knowledge you built up learning Illustrator and Photoshop, well, that'll be worthless. But no, there's a lot of value in that. But then on the other hand, there's a lot to learn with Figma itself, and all of the special capabilities that it has that we never would have had with Photoshop, and how much closer that brings us to engineers, for example. So I can see that being amplified radically with AI. And I think about it a lot in the context of tooling, right? That there was a day when a designer needed to get images for every single person in their list of people in this mock-up of the UI, and then they had to fill in all of the names and all the information, and then they would duplicate that. Now it's a snap, and all of your extensions for Figma fill all of that in, and then you can take those I think it's gonna multiply what designers are capable of from an executional perspective. And maybe it will mean that there's less execution as part of a designer's role. That creates space for more strategy, and it creates questions about how close and overlapping and similar is the role of a product designer and a product manager. Or maybe on the other end, it creates a lot of overlap between engineering and design. Maybe an engineer could do a lot more design if the tooling allowed it through AI, right? So there's a lot of fluidity there, and I think it's all kind of up for grabs, which is exciting. That's always been true, and I think it'll always be true.